and what can be done about inflation. All that to come, but first, it's your morning headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:30. I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB newsroom. Asylum seekers who cross the English Channel will be flown to Rwanda for processing under new government plans. An initial £120 million is expected to be given to the Rwandan government as part of the controversial scheme. Refugee charities are describing the move as cruel. In a speech on tackling illegal migration, the Prime Minister is expected to say action is needed to combat people smugglers. Shadow Culture Secretary Lucy Powell told GB News the plan is too expensive and won't work.
It's unworkable, it's incredibly expensive, and it won't do what the government say it will do. A similar scheme in Australia was found to have cost £1.7 million per person.
Dozens of NHS patients have waited more than 3 years for hospital care in England because of the growing backlog. Figures show more than 6 million people are currently on waiting lists, with 23,000 waiting over 2 years to start routine treatment. Top surgeons are describing the data as shocking. Russia is warning it will bolster its defences in the Baltic if Sweden and Finland join NATO. The two countries are on the verge of applying for membership. The deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, says if they do, the balance needs to be restored and there'll be no more talk of a nuclear-free region. TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Now, the Home Affairs Minister, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, I should say, Priti Patel, is finalising her plan to send some Channel crossing asylum seekers 4,500 miles away to the former Belgian colony of Rwanda for processing. She's currently in the African country stamping out the final details of the supposedly £120 million deal that Labour calls unethical and unworkable. Now, when asked about a similar proposal to process asylum seekers abroad on Ascension Island, a UK territory in the Atlantic Ocean, that was a proposal a few years ago, well, 2/3 of Conservative voters at that time supported the idea in September 2020, compared to just 22% of Labour voters. Overall, the British public backed the idea by 40 to 35%. Now, under the Rwanda deal being sought, the UK seeks to have the asylum claims of some Channel migrants processed in Rwanda, of course, and be encouraged to settle there, as opposed to the UK. However, according to the asylum statistics released by the House of Commons Library, almost 1,000 Rwandans themselves applied for asylum in the UK. So is this situation actually workable, and what does it mean? Well, our Home Affairs and Security editor, Mark White, is live for us now. Mark, what on earth do we know about what may be announced later today?
Well, the crucial thing is that there are some key details that are missing, and we are expecting more in the way of a briefing from the government as to how exactly this will operate. Clearly, as far as the asylum seekers are concerned, we're told that it will be mainly single men, not family groups that come across, who will be sent to Rwanda, and it seems it's a one-way ticket. So they are not going there to be processed for reconsideration to be returned to the UK, but we think that they are going to be then offered, if they pass the asylum process in Rwanda, the chance to be housed in that particular country. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, is in Rwanda as we speak, looking at some of the accommodation that's going to be used to house these people as their asylum applications are being housed in that country. And as we speak, there are more in the way of those asylum seekers coming across on small boats today. Just in the last few minutes, another lifeboat has come into Dover Harbour with 50 illegal immigrants. 500, 600 close to yesterday came across. It's expected that this year's figures will well exceed the 28,500 who crossed the channel illegally last year. So it's clear there is an imperative from Boris Johnson, the Home Secretary, on their part to do something. Whether this will work is going to be challenged. It's likely, of course, to be challenged by those groups, by those human rights organisations who've already indicated that they will take it to the courts to stop anybody being processed offshore.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for that summary. It's a fascinating situation, and no doubt we'll be hearing more from you throughout the day as more details of this emerge. Mark, thanks for joining us. Well, now let's move on to discuss this more with Alp Mehmet, the chairman of Migration Watch UK. Thanks for joining us this morning, Alp. From what we understand about this proposal, it's relatively similar to something that Australia has been doing for several years. In your view, might this work to reduce those dangerous channel crossings?
I think properly implemented and firmly implemented, it will certainly discourage a lot of people from coming here, and certainly discourage the young working age men. And by and large, that's what they are, who are coming here looking for a better life. That from the head of the Refugee Council, who said it's a better life they're looking for rather than asylum as such, which is intended for something very different.
Do we not need to have two sides to this policy? Yes, discouraging people taking the very dangerous routes, but also offering a proper process by which people may come to this country, a legitimate channel that is properly assessed. Are we potentially missing out the other half of this equation here?
Well, we don't know. We haven't heard the detail yet, and we're about to, I gather, or some detail. But the fact is that there are already schemes for bringing people, genuine refugees from camps from various parts of the world. We're taking in Afghans, we've taken in Iraqis, we are taking in hundreds, potentially hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, and they are genuine refugees, and by and large, women and children. What we're talking about here with the channel is that it's become a system, a way for migrating into this country. Get yourself here, get your foot onto a British vessel, and you're home and dry, is really what has all but happened now. And that's what we've got to stop. So long as people can get here by whatever means, and having arrived, stay here, then I'm afraid they will continue to come. And this year, it looks as if it continues at the present rate, we could be looking at 60, 70, 80,000 people coming in this way to settle in this country, because that is what their intention is.
It is a remarkably dangerous thing to do, controlled by criminal gangs, in many times costing those trying to make the journey thousands of pounds, euros, or whatever other currency may be used. Clearly, something needs to be done about this situation, but let's just explain exactly what it is that these desperate people in many cases are told. Because the United Kingdom, up until this point, hasn't really been able to do anything thanks to a complex myriad of international law. We've not really been able to sort or distinct those who come here whose asylum claims are rejected. We can't get them to leave the country. Would this change that situation?
Well, if we say you're not going to come in, whatever happens, even if your asylum applications are successful, then yes, I mean, that's putting a stop to it. However, I don't entirely agree that at the moment, because of international treaties and laws, we can't send people back. The reason why they're not being sent back at the moment to the safe country they're coming from, and by and large they're coming from France, is because the French won't have them back. And this is caught up in, I think, pre-Brexit arrangements to a large extent, and an election coming up there where I don't think the president wants to be seen as caving into British demands and accepting people back. But ultimately, one of the problems is that many migrants are getting into the EU because of their porous borders, external borders. Although Greece is pretty much doing the sort of thing that we've been calling this government to do, our government to do, and sending people back, and also holding on to them in camps once they arrive. I believe that that is one of the elements of the scheme that is going to be announced by the Prime Minister today, because not everyone will be flown to Rwanda. It seems that there will be a centre set up here at one of the former airports, military camps, and people will be able to stay there fairly strictly monitored until their applications are heard. But there again, it all depends what happens at the end of the process. If they're denied asylum, are they then sent back to their countries or from whence they came?
Well, I suppose we will find more of this detail out later today when the Prime Minister speaks. But for now, Alp Mehmet, thank you so much for talking through that issue with us there. Let's turn now to Steve Valdez-Simmons, who's the Refugee and Migrants' Rights Programme Director at Amnesty International UK. Thanks for making the time for us this morning. This is a controversial idea amongst many lawyers, amongst some politicians, although looking at opinion polls, it seems like the British public is broadly in support of the idea of offshore processing. How do we fix that situation? Why is there such a distinction there between those different sectors and their opinions?
Well, partly it's because of the lack of information, frankly, in the public domain. Partly, again, because of government ministers and indeed people like your last speaker. If people look at what happened with the Australian policy, they are likely to be much deterred from it. Australia has not offshored, as it's called, anyone since 2014. But it has held on to its offshore facilities because it's been unable to shut them down, even though it's been trying since 2017 to do so. And it's been paying huge amounts of money, unfortunately, to do incredible amounts of cruelty to the relatively few people that it's offshored, while people have continued to arrive in Australia, including by boat, since it introduced the policy all those years ago.
Because, of course, when that policy was introduced, the Liberal Party government, as it was then under Tony Abbott, put forward a lot of communications saying that not a single boat arrived in the next year after that policy was introduced. Are you saying that that was the case, but then it started to break down, the system started to break down sort of shortly after that situation?
Actually, there's no evidence that the system of offshoring itself had led at any time to a reduction in people arriving by boats. People continued after it was introduced. Australia went to even further lengths of not offshoring people, but physically intercepting boats and forcing them back dangerously to unsafe places. And yes, that did deter some boats. I mean, there were some scandalous reports of apparent connection between Australia and indeed the boats, the smugglers themselves operating them to do this. Now, it's a whole scandal that Australia has largely been condemned for internationally and domestically, and not just by lawyers, by doctors, by many members of the public and many politicians of all political persuasions. And it's something that Australia is trying to abandon because it's done so much harm. While it's true, certain Australian politicians who have long defended the policy make great hay about persuading foolish people here, frankly, amongst our government to try and adopt it as some sort of cover to cover up for their shame.
Interestingly, though, depending on it's tricky to do in a conversation like this, but just in an intellectual space, if we leave the morality or otherwise of the policies to one side, of the two that we were talking about there, the pushing back the boats versus offshore detention and processing facilities, it's the former rather than the latter that actually worked to do anything in Australia. And we're thinking about adopting the latter. So potentially we wouldn't be able to replicate Australia's relative success in that area, morally or otherwise. I wonder, though, looking at why we've seen this big increase in boats crossing from France to the UK. I think I remember a conversation that we had on another show on this channel not so long ago, where you were saying that actually the number of lorries and trains that migrants were coming across on has fallen considerably. And it might be a similar number of people crossing the channel, but just doing it by other means. Is that still your assessment?
For most of the last 3 years, while there's been so much attention to boat crossings, there had been no increase, and at times there had been a fall in the number of people claiming asylum in this country. And we know the people crossing on these boats so visibly and so clearly are all seeking and do enter our asylum system. So clearly there was a huge displacement from one type of journey that was largely invisible to another type that's very visible and has got a lot of attention. Now, it is true that asylum numbers in the country here have started to go up from towards the end of last year. We'll have to see what impact that has. But they start from a relatively low base, and we still continue to be far behind other countries, including dramatically behind, for example, France, in the number of people who enter our asylum system or whom we provide asylum to.
Interesting that this particular situation of small boats coming across might not in and itself have represented in the last couple of years an increase in actual illegal migration. It might just be a different way in which people have come across. Really interesting there, and some big questions for policymakers. But for now, Steve Valdez-Simmons, thank you so much for joining us here and talking through that issue from the other side of the aisle. Now, 26-year-old Ali Harbi Ali will spend the rest of his life in prison for murdering Southend West MP Sir David Amess. At yesterday's sentencing, Mr Justice Sweeney handed the terrorist a whole life order. Ali Harbi Ali, an Islamic State supporter, had claimed he was an NHS worker moving to Southend before stabbing Sir David 20 times at a routine surgery in Leigh-on-Sea. Turning to the horrified witnesses, Ali proclaimed that he wanted, quote, every Parliament minister who signed up for the bombing of Syria, who agreed to the Iraq war, to die. And leaving a fact aside that Sir David was not a government minister, he said that Sir David deserved to die, a really confused individual. How prevalent a problem, however, is radical Islamic terrorism in the UK, and what more can be done to put a stop to it? Well, let's talk through this now with Dr. Rakib Esen, a social policy analyst. Welcome to the programme. First of all, I suppose, how large a problem is this in the UK? We've seen an MP murdered, we've seen a car bomb go off outside a Liverpool hospital. What's going on?
Well, I think, Tom, that we have a very serious problem in the UK when it comes to Islamist extremism, and we certainly have a problem when it comes to discussing it. If we're talking about the numbers, there have been recent figures which suggest that the MI5's broader terror-related watch list, that in the region of 8 to 9 in 10 of the individuals on that watch list are Islamist extremists. And when we're looking at this phenomenon more broadly, one of the main problems, Tom, is that there is a reluctance within our political and media classes to really discuss the dangers of Islamist extremism. And I think that was demonstrated in the aftermath of Sir David Amess's terror-related killing, where you had people talk about social media anonymity. Others were talking about our confrontational and adversarial political culture. culture, which has existed for decades, primarily because of our largely two-party system. So I think, Tom, the main issue that we have is that there's a great deal of deflection as opposed to identifying the key ideological motivations behind these barbaric acts.
It is remarkable that actually, particularly some Conservative members of Parliament, people that you would think would be some of the first to call out radical Islamic terrorism when they see it, was talking about mean tweets and etiquette on social media as if it had anything to do with the barbaric Islamic State ideology. Are we at risk here when we're dealing with Islamist terrorism in this country, that some people want to attach their own particular policy hobby horses onto the issue, whether it's internet censorship or anything else, and we get distracted, therefore, from the crux of the issue?
I couldn't agree more, Tom. There was discussions about issues surrounding online harms and social media anonymity, and then referring to this as David's Law. But if the government was very serious about responding to what happened to Sir David Emmis, then it would really step up its efforts in terms of discussing Islamist extremism and coming up with robust policies in terms of tackling it. But I'd make this point, Tom, that there are people who ultimately they want to restrict the debate. They say that if we talk too much about Islamist extremism, this is almost a form of anti-Muslim prejudice. But that is a fundamental disservice to law-abiding, patriotic, humanitarian British Muslims who, much like the general population, are deeply concerned about the threat of Islamist extremism. Indeed, the threat of Islamist extremism is more immediate for them because it is within their local communities. So I think that if we fail to discuss matters of Islamist extremism and that we do not look at faults within our existing counter-terrorism structures, then what we are doing is making a number of local communities across the country more unsafe and more unstable.
Think of anything more perverse than trying to claim that calling out radical Islamist terrorism as if that is somehow normal amongst Islamic communities. I mean, that seems just an incredibly offensive thing to do, and yet so often that's the sort of avenue of thought by which many trying to be generous and open-hearted go down. I'm afraid we've run to the end of this conversation. We must have you back soon. Dr. Rakib Ehsan, thank you so much for talking us through that issue there. Now, finally, the UK inflation rate is the highest it's been in 30 years, currently 7%, higher than France, but lower than Germany, Spain, the United States and the Eurozone average as a whole. Well, the entire Western world is facing, of course, this cost of living squeeze. Prices were already rising in the aftermath of the pandemic restrictions and almost unprecedented money printing. And now the war in Ukraine is impacting our cost of living even more. So can there be any end in sight to this tightening squeeze? What can be done in policy terms? Well, joining me now is Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor for the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Welcome to the programme. What on earth can ministers do to try and stop inflation? It seems to me that all of the potential solutions here are all pretty painful in and of themselves.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of those solutions is raising interest rates and therefore stopping the growth in the economy as it is. We're already hearing of concerns that maybe in the second quarter of this year, we're going to see a contraction in GDP. It's happening up to a point already in Europe. So the issues are very international and there isn't a huge amount you can do by just raising interest rates. But of course, here in the UK, we've got the extra problem, which is the electricity cap going up. It's going to hit households this month, so it's going to increase inflation even further, and we're talking about possibly 8%, 9%, maybe double-digit inflation, whereas some countries in Europe are already beginning to think that they may have been coming to the end of this increase in inflation and there will be a slowdown from here on. Well, remains to be seen on what happens in the Ukraine. But otherwise, I presume other things that can be done is subsidise prices even more, electricity prices in particular, and maybe, which is one of the things that was done at the time of the financial crisis, is lowering VAT possibly. That, of course, will affect what the government collects in terms of taxes, and it probably still needs it for the NHS and so on. But it could be done temporarily. It can have an instant impact on inflation, and then you can bring it up again, which is exactly what happened last time around. And then, of course, if anything, they increased it even further to the 20% we're seeing now. So there are areas of possible intervention by the government. The question is, are they at all prepared to consider them?
Some of these possible areas, the ones that, for example, ask more taxpayer cash, or rather borrowed cash, to be given out to individuals, is there not a risk there that if we give people more money, as some are suggesting, what actually happens there is you get a greater demand pull inflation? Prices rise higher as there's just more money sloshing about in the system that we've borrowed or printed?
Of course, but the real concern now, though, is that spending is going to be reduced. As we know, quite a lot of people may be falling into poverty, certainly fuel poverty over the next few months. And what you're seeing is that savings, which have gone up quite significantly, people are now much more, worried about whether they'll be able to, in fact, sort of spend enough to feed themselves and their families. And they are beginning to withdraw those savings, or at least what they're doing is they're putting less to the savings, bank, if you like, that they have every month. So there's already been research that suggests that people's attitude is already changing. They're going to have to draw on whatever they've saved for the spending to continue. But of course, we are a consumer-led society, and you're quite right to suggest that obviously, the more money we leave in people's pockets, the more likely it is that they're going to go out and spend it. But remember that for the lower paid in particular, the biggest items of spending tend to be food and energy or fuel costs as well at the pump, which have gone up very significantly. And they're the ones that need the extra support. So if you allow them to have a bit more, but do it in a way which is targeted, so that those at the lower end are the ones that benefit, at least what you will be doing is eliminating the possibility of so many people falling into poverty, which is what worries everyone at present.
And I suppose in the medium to long term, also supply-side reform rather than just dealing with the demand side. I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme here, but Vicky Price, thanks so much for talking us through those issues. They're really important for people up and down the country. That's it today. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick and Mercy. But first, here's the weather.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some